You won't believe what happened after the HOA declared my backyard a public park. I decided to take matters into my own hands, and what came next will blow your mind. But before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. The protagonist, a homeowner named Alex, has a quiet, suburban life in a well-maintained neighborhood governed by a strict Homeowners Association, HOA. Everything seemed peaceful in their cozy home. Nestled in a well-manicured community where everyone abided by the rules, and life moved along without much friction. Alex enjoyed this predictable lifestyle, finding comfort in the serenity of their backyard, where they would unwind after work, tend to their garden, and occasionally entertain friends. Their backyard was more than just an extension of their home. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could retreat from the world. Alex had always been proud of their carefully cultivated outdoor space. The flower beds were meticulously arranged, the grass was always green and well-trimmed, and they had installed a small, charming fountain that created a peaceful ambience. Everything seemed peaceful until one day. Alex received an official letter from the HOA declaring that their backyard would be designated as a public park. The letter, stamped with the HOA's formal logo, felt more like a legal decree than a simple notification. It announced that the HOA, in a move designed to foster community engagement and green living, had decided to transform several private backyards into public park areas. Alex was taken aback, reading the letter over and over, as if the words on the page would magically change. The idea that their backyard, a space they had worked so hard to make their own, would now be shared with the entire neighborhood felt absurd. The letter further explained that the HOA was implementing this new community initiative as part of a broader vision to make the neighborhood more welcoming and interactive, turning private yards into common areas for everyone to enjoy. In Alex's eyes, the whole concept was completely out of touch with the reality of suburban life. The thought of having random neighbors, and perhaps even strangers, wandering through their backyard was deeply unsettling. The letter went on to specify that this decision was final, with no room for objection. The HOA's tone was both authoritative and dismissive, as though Alex's opinion didn't matter. It claimed that the HOA had thoroughly reviewed the proposal and determined that turning several private properties into public spaces would benefit the community as a whole. The HOA even cited a few case studies from other neighborhoods that had implemented similar plans, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being steamrolled. The notion that their private sanctuary would be transformed into an open park where kids could run through their garden, strangers might picnic on their lawn, and families could treat their backyard like a public playground was horrifying. The more Alex thought about it, the more the situation felt like a violation. It wasn't just the loss of privacy, it was the complete disregard for their rights as a property owner. The HOA didn't even offer compensation or suggest any alternatives. There were no discussions about how to compensate homeowners for this loss of personal space or the potential wear and tear on their property. The idea that the HOA could simply decide, without any real input from the homeowners, to take control of private property was shocking. It wasn't just Alex's backyard that was being affected. It was a wider issue that seemed to point to an increasing disregard for individual freedoms in favor of a top-down, one-size-fits-all solution. Feeling both helpless and furious, Alex set out to understand the HOA's authority better. They began combing through the HOA's documentation, looking for any legal recourse or ways to challenge the decision. In the process, Alex discovered that the HOA's bylaws were extensive, and many of them gave the organization sweeping power over nearly every aspect of homeowners' lives. From how the grass should be mowed to what colors the house could be painted, the HOA had its hand in almost every detail of the neighborhood. But when it came to taking away part of someone's private property for public use, it seemed like a serious overstep. Alex's mind raced with questions. How could the HOA claim this power? Was there a precedent for such a decision? Could they really force people to share their private property without their consent? Alex attempted to reach out to the HOA board, hoping for some clarification or at least a chance to voice their concerns. They scheduled a meeting with the board members, but it became clear right away that the HOA's stance was unyielding. The members were polite but firm, explaining that this was part of a larger vision for the neighborhood and that it would be a benefit to everyone in the long run. They presented the idea as a win-win scenario. By turning private yards into public parks, they would create a space where people could come together, interact, and build a sense of community. Alex's objections, however, were met with indifference. It was as if their personal connection to their home and the sanctity of their private property didn't matter. The HOA board seemed completely unconcerned with the emotional and practical implications for homeowners like Alex. Frustrated by the lack of empathy from the HOA board, Alex took a more proactive approach. They started reaching out to neighbors, hoping to find others who share their concerns. Some were sympathetic, but many shrugged it off, believing that the public park idea was a good one. Others were just too intimidated by the HOA's power to speak out. After all, the HOA had the ability to fine people, enforce rules, and even take legal action if homeowners didn't comply with its decisions. It quickly became clear that Alex was fighting an uphill battle. As the weeks went on, the idea that the HOA would be able to proceed with their plan without any significant opposition began to sink in. The frustration mounted, and Alex started feeling trapped in a situation that seemed increasingly impossible to escape. But then, an idea began to form, one that would allow Alex to fight back, albeit in a way that might be seen as extreme. If the HOA was going to take over their backyard and treat it like a public park, perhaps Alex could turn the tables and make the space entirely inaccessible to the public. What if they could build a barrier so imposing, so fortified, that would make the HOA's public park idea untenable? Alex didn't just want to put up a regular fence. No, this was about sending a clear message, about reclaiming their property and telling the HOA that they had no right to treat it like a community space. The thought of constructing a massive, prison-like fence around their backyard gave Alex a strange sense of empowerment. It wasn't just about blocking access. It was about making a statement that would be impossible to ignore. If the HOA wanted to take their property, they would have to deal with the consequences. Determined, Alex began researching options. They looked into various types of fencing, considering everything from high iron gates to reinforced steel barriers. The goal wasn't just to prevent people from walking into their yard. It was to make a bold statement that would make the HOA think twice before messing with their property again. The plan was to make it so clear that Alex had no intention of allowing the HOA to use their backyard as a public park that would send ripples throughout the entire neighborhood. If the HOA wanted a park, they would have to find another way to build it, not at Alex's expense. The more Alex thought about it, the more they realized this would be a battle of wills. The HOA had the power, but Alex had something even more valuable: their right to live freely and without interference in their own home. The prison fence was going to be their response, a symbol of resistance and autonomy in the face of a system that had overstepped its boundaries. Determined to take control of the situation and send a clear message to the HOA, Alex embarked on the next phase of their plan, building the prison-like fence around their backyard. This wasn't just a regular backyard fence. It was going to be a massive, imposing structure, one that would make it clear to the HOA and their neighbors that they were serious. Alex envisioned a fortress, a symbol of defiance against the HOA's overreach. As the idea grew in Alex's mind, the thought of the fence became more than just a physical barrier. It became a declaration of independence, an assertion of personal rights, and an unspoken challenge to the HOA's authority. The first step in the process was figuring out what kind of fence to build. Alex had no interest in putting up some flimsy wooden structure that would be easily bypassed. No, they wanted something that would make a statement, something that would be impossible to ignore. After spending hours researching various materials, Alex settled on reinforced steel as the primary material for the fence. It was strong, durable, and would give the fence the fortress-like appearance they were after. But Alex knew that building such a fence would require more than just materials. It would need planning, resources, and most importantly, time. The next challenge was obtaining the necessary permits. While Alex knew that the HOA's ruling gave them little say in how the backyard was to be used, they were still bound by local regulations. Before going full throttle with their plans, Alex decided to check with the local zoning department to ensure they weren't violating any laws. The process wasn't simple and it wasn't quick, but Alex was determined. They spoke with several officials, explaining their vision for the fence and asking if any special permits would be required. As it turned out, the local government had zoning laws regarding the height of fences in residential areas, and any structure above a certain height required approval. This posed a significant challenge. Alex's vision for the fence involved towering steel bars that would dwarf any typical residential barrier. However, after several meetings with the zoning department, Alex managed to secure the necessary approvals. The city officials, perhaps amused by the audacity of the project, offered only the basic feedback required by law. The fence couldn't exceed a certain height, it had to adhere to safety standards, and the design had to be approved. Alex wasn't deterred by these constraints. After all, the goal was to create something massive, imposing, and unmissable. The process of getting these permits took longer than expected, and Alex had to deal with some bureaucratic hurdles along the way. But in the end, the groundwork was laid. They were ready to move forward. Now came the time to actually build the fence. Alex enlisted the help of a contractor who specialized in heavy-duty construction projects. This wasn't going to be a typical backyard fence installation. They needed someone who could help design and build a structure that would be as secure and intimidating as Alex imagined it to be. Together, they discussed the specifics: the height of the fence, the thickness of the steel bars, and the overall design. Alex wanted the fence to resemble something out of a maximum security prison: tall, solid, and completely forbidding. The contractor was initially shocked by the idea, but quickly warmed up to the challenge. They designed the fence to have steel bars that stood at least 12 feet tall, with vertical iron slats spaced so closely together that it would be impossible for anyone to slip through. The contractor suggested adding barbed wire along the top of the fence to make it even more difficult to climb, and Alex eagerly agreed. The design also included reinforced gates that could be locked from the inside, ensuring that the backyard remained completely inaccessible to anyone the homeowner didn't want to enter. The contractor estimated that the project would take about 2 months to complete, given the complexity of the design and the materials involved. While this seemed like a long time, Alex felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the fence would soon be a reality. As the weeks passed, Alex eagerly checked in on the progress of the construction. The steel bars began to go up, slowly transforming the once open, inviting backyard into an impenetrable fortress. Neighbors started to take notice. Some were curious, asking Alex what they were doing, while others simply gawked in disbelief at the enormous steel structure taking shape. Alex didn't respond directly to their questions, choosing instead to let the fence speak for itself. The HOA had made their decision, and now it was time to show them what it meant to challenge Alex's rights as a homeowner. The larger the fence became, the more Alex felt a sense of pride. The barrier was growing taller every day, and soon it would be the focal point of the entire neighborhood. Word spread quickly. Alex's neighbors began discussing the project among themselves, and before long, rumors about the prison fence started circulating throughout the community. Some found it amusing, while others were outraged. A few neighbors who had been skeptical of the HOA's plans came over to express their support, telling Alex that they admired their defiance and courage. But most of the neighborhood was either indifferent or hostile. The HOA, of course, wasn't pleased with the construction. They had sent several letters warning Alex about the possibility of further fines or legal action if the fence exceeded the agreed-upon height limits or didn't adhere to their aesthetic guidelines. But Alex wasn't concerned about the HOA's threats. They had already jumped through all the necessary legal hoops and secured the necessary permits. They had followed the letter of the law. Now it was time to follow their own principles. In the middle of the construction, Alex began to feel a growing sense of purpose. The fence had become more than just a defensive structure. It had become a symbol. It was a stand against a system that sought to control every aspect of their life. It represented resistance to the HOA's overreach, an assertion of personal boundaries that couldn't be ignored. The fence wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about making a statement about freedom, about privacy, and about the right to live on one's own terms. As the fence neared completion, Alex realized that it wasn't only the HOA they were up against. They were also facing the expectations of their neighbors, many of whom had bought into the HOA's narrative of community improvement and shared spaces. But Alex was undeterred. The fence wasn't just a response to the HOA's actions. It was a challenge to the very idea that anyone, especially an unelected organization like the HOA, could decide what was best for their home and property. When the fence was finally completed, it stood as a towering monument to defiance. The once open backyard was now a fortress, its steel bars glinting in the sunlight, casting long shadows over the garden below. The barbed wire along the top created an intimidating effect, making it clear that this was no ordinary fence. It was a barrier meant to protect not just the backyard, but also Alex's autonomy and personal rights. The construction crew stepped back, admiring the sheer scale of the project. Alex stood on the other side of the newly erected fence, gazing at the fortress they had built, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The HOA had wanted to turn their backyard into a public park, but instead, Alex had created a symbol of resistance, a powerful statement about the value of personal freedom and the right to control one's own property. With the fence now completed, Alex knew that the HOA would likely try to take further action. They had made it clear that they wouldn't back down. But Alex was ready for whatever came next. They had fought for their rights and had taken a stand that few would ever forget. The prison fence wasn't just a structure. It was a reminder that sometimes fighting for what's right meant taking matters into your own hands, no matter how daunting the challenge might seem. As soon as Alex's massive, imposing fence was completed, it became the talk of the neighborhood. Some neighbors were amazed by the audacity of the project, while others were appalled. Alex had, in their mind, won the battle for personal space and autonomy. The HOA, however, wasn't about to let such a bold challenge slide without retaliation. It wasn't just about the fence, it was about authority, about maintaining control over the community. The HOA's power rested on its ability to regulate the way people lived, to enforce rules, and to ensure that no one stepped out of line. Alex's rebellious act had threatened that power, and they had to make an example of it. The first warning letter arrived just days after the fence was completed. It was a formal notification from the HOA stating that Alex had violated several key provisions of the community's guidelines. The letter accused Alex of building a structure that was out of compliance with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards and stated that the fence's height exceeded the limits set forth in the HOA's bylaws. The tone of the letter was condescending, filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate and assert the HOA's dominance. Alex read it with growing anger and disbelief. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about the HOA's desperate attempt to reassert control. The HOA demanded that the fence be either modified to meet the community's guidelines or be entirely removed at Alex's expense. Failure to comply, the letter warned, would result in substantial fines and further legal action. Alex's heart sank when they saw the dollar amounts listed as potential fines, thousands of dollars for every month the fence remained in place. The HOA wasn't messing around, but Alex had already anticipated this move. They had taken great care to ensure that the fence was legally built, with all necessary permits and approvals in place. The local zoning department had signed off on the project, and the fence complied with every safety regulation and legal requirement. Alex immediately sought legal counsel. They contacted an attorney specializing in property rights and homeowners associations. The lawyer, after reviewing the situation, agreed that the HOA was overstepping its bounds. The fence, while unconventional, was built within the law, and the HOA had no right to demand its removal simply because it didn't fit the community's aesthetic standards. According to the lawyer, Alex had a solid case. The HOA's power had limits, and their attempt to force Alex to tear down the fence was likely an illegal move. However, the lawyer also warned that battling the HOA would be a long, costly fight. Lawsuits could take years to resolve, and there was no guarantee of success. The HOA had deep pockets and the resources to drag out the process, which could result in significant legal fees. But Alex, already committed to standing up for their rights, wasn't deterred. They decided to fight back. At the same time, Alex began to notice changes in the neighborhood. The HOA's influence was pervasive, and it didn't take long for the community to turn against them. Some neighbors who had initially supported the idea of a public park started to grow uneasy. The HOA's push for conformity was alienating people who had once been happy to live in a peaceful, rule-abiding neighborhood. The fence had become a symbol of defiance, but it was also creating a divide. People were starting to question the HOA's decisions and authority. The more the HOA retaliated against Alex, the more they alienated themselves from the very people they were supposed to serve. There were whispers around the neighborhood of forming a new petition to challenge the HOA's authority, with some people even talking about leaving the HOA altogether. Despite the growing discontent in the neighborhood, the HOA refused to back down. They sent several more letters demanding that the fence be removed or modified. The threats grew more serious, and Alex's sense of defiance only increased. The HOA was escalating the situation, and Alex wasn't going to let them intimidate them into submission. After all, what was the point of having a home if one couldn't even control the space around it? This wasn't just about a fence. This was about personal freedom, about autonomy over one's own property. Alex and their lawyer decided to take a stand. They filed a formal complaint against the HOA, arguing that the organization was violating their rights as a homeowner. The complaint cited the HOA's lack of authority to regulate private property in such an invasive manner, especially when the fence had been built within the confines of local laws. Alex's lawyer argued that the HOA had overreached by attempting to impose subjective aesthetic standards on private property, especially when there was no harm being caused to the community by the fence. Meanwhile, Alex started a campaign to rally support among their neighbors. They held informal meetings, gathering people who were also frustrated with the HOA's heavy-handed approach. More and more people came forward to express their dissatisfaction with the HOA's tactics. It wasn't long before a petition began circulating, demanding that the HOA back off and stop trying to impose such rigid standards on homeowners. The HOA was no longer the benevolent force it once appeared to be. In fact, many homeowners began to view the HOA as an oppressive body that was more interested in maintaining control than in the well-being of the community. As the legal battle with the HOA stretched on, Alex found themselves gaining more and more support from the neighbors. Some even offered to contribute financially to help cover the legal costs, while others volunteered to attend community meetings to challenge the HOA's authority. The momentum was building, and it felt like the tide was turning. The HOA, however, remained steadfast in its determination to maintain its power. They threatened to take Alex to court, claiming that the fence violated the community's aesthetics and was a hazard to property values. The HOA's lawyers, armed with their legal expertise, began to ramp up the pressure, and the situation began to feel like a full-scale war between Alex and the HOA. But Alex wasn't backing down. They were prepared to go the distance, ready to fight for their home, their privacy, and their right to live without constant interference. The legal battle would be long and expensive, but Alex felt it was a battle worth fighting. They weren't just standing up for themselves. They were standing up for everyone in the neighborhood who felt oppressed by the HOA's overreach. The fence had become more than just a physical structure. It had become a symbol of resistance, a statement that no one should have a right to dictate what could or could not be done within the confines of someone's private property. In the end, the battle reached a boiling point. A final court date was set, and both sides prepared for a showdown. Alex's legal team was confident in their case, while the HOA's lawyers prepared to argue that the fence was an eyesore and a threat to community values. The fate of the fence and the future of Alex's relationship with the HOA would be determined in that courtroom. In a dramatic twist, just days before the court date, the HOA suddenly withdrew its demand for the fence to be removed. It turned out that the HOA had realized they were fighting a losing battle. The community's support for Alex was growing, and the legal fees were piling up on both sides. The HOA knew that the publicity of such a case could hurt their reputation, and they decided to settle. Instead of forcing Alex to tear down the fence, The HOA agreed to make several concessions, including a revised set of community guidelines that would allow for more personalized backyard designs and greater autonomy for homeowners. The battle had been won. Alex's defiant stand against the HOA's overreach had forced the organization to back down. The fence remained in place, a permanent reminder of the fight for personal freedom and the right to control one's property. In the end, the HOA learned a valuable lesson. There were limits to their power, and Alex had successfully demonstrated that those limits could be challenged. The community, too, had learned something valuable, that standing up for what was right, no matter how daunting the odds, could bring about real change.